June 1940. The swastika flew over Paris. In just 6 weeks, the German Wehrmacht had done what the Imperial Army failed to do in 4 years of World War I. They had shattered the French army, considered the finest in Europe, and pushed the British Expeditionary Force into the sea at Dunkirk. Adolf Hitler stood at the pinnacle of his power. To the outside observer, the war in Europe was effectively over. Britain stood alone, isolated, stripped of her allies, and seemingly defenseless against the German juggernaut. The logic of war dictated one final move. Military history and common sense pointed in a single direction, across the English Channel. The German High Command, the OKW, began drafting plans for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of the British Isles. The world held its breath, expecting the Luftwaffe to darken the skies over London and panzers to roll through the English countryside. The defeat of Britain would secure Germany's western flank forever and end the war. But in the quiet map rooms of Berlin, something inexplicable was happening. While the world looked west, Hitler's eyes were already turning east. In July 1940, less than a month after the fall of France, Hitler dropped a bombshell on his top generals. He didn't want to talk about landing craft or air superiority over the Channel. He wanted to talk about the Soviet Union. He ordered plans for an invasion of Russia to be ready by the following spring. His generals were stunned. The Soviet Union was technically an ally. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in 1939, guaranteed peace between the two dictatorships. Soviet trains were arriving daily in Germany, loaded with grain, oil, and raw materials that kept the German war machine running. To attack Russia meant opening a two-front war, the very strategic nightmare that had doomed Germany in World War I. It seemed like suicide. Why would a rational military leader, on the verge of total victory in the West, suddenly turn to face a colossus in the East? The answer was not simple madness. It was a cold, ruthless calculation born from a strategic trap that few realized Germany was in. Despite the victory parades in Berlin, the Third Reich was facing a crisis. The British were refusing to surrender. Churchill remained defiant. And as long as Britain stood, the Royal Navy blockaded Europe, strangling Germany's access to the world's resources. Germany was winning battles, but it was losing the economic war. The Wehrmacht ran on oil and rubber, resources Germany did not possess. They were currently dependent on imports from Stalin, making the German military vulnerable to Soviet blackmail. Hitler realized that he was conquering a continent that he could not feed or fuel. He concluded that Britain held out only because they hoped for a Soviet intervention. Therefore, in a twisted logic, the way to London lay through Moscow. To secure the resources for a long war and force Britain to its knees, he believed he had to destroy the Red Army in a single, lightning campaign. It was a decision that would doom millions, but in 1940, it looked like the only path to absolute power. September 1940. The skies over London were burning. Hermann Göring, the bombastic chief of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that his air force would crush the Royal Air Force in weeks. He promised that British cities would be reduced to rubble, forcing Churchill to beg for peace without a single German soldier needing to cross the English Channel. But as autumn set in, the wreckage of German bombers littering the English countryside told a different story. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. The Battle of Britain was being lost. This aerial failure exposed a terrifying reality for the German High Command. Without total air superiority, an invasion of Britain Operation Sea Lion was a death sentence. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had been mauled during the invasion of Norway just months earlier. They had lost half their destroyers and crucial cruisers. Against the might of the British Royal Navy, which still ruled the waves with an iron fist, the German surface fleet was pitifully small. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Navy, gave Hitler a grim assessment. The Wehrmacht could conquer a continent, but it could not cross 20 miles of water. Hitler was trapped in a strategic cage of his own making. He had conquered France, but he had not won the war. The British blockade was tightening. Every day that Britain stood meant the blockade continued to strangle the German economy. German intelligence also began to pick up disturbing signals from across the Atlantic. The United States, the sleeping industrial giant, was beginning to stir. President Roosevelt was maneuvering to support Britain. Hitler calculated that by 1942, American intervention might become decisive. He felt he was racing against time. In the Führer's mind, The war could not be won by sitting on the French coast, staring at the white cliffs of Dover. A static war meant a war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Germany lacked the resources to fight. He needed to break the stalemate. He returned to his oldest obsession, laid out years earlier in Mein Kampf, Lebensraum, living space in the East. But now, ideology merged with cold, military necessity. The logic presented to the General Staff was seductive in its simplicity. Hitler argued that Britain was only holding on because they hoped for two things: American entry into the war and Soviet intervention. If Germany smashed the Soviet Union, two things would happen. First, Japan would be freed from the threat of Russia in the rear, allowing them to expand in the Pacific and tie down the Americans. Second, Britain would lose its last potential ally in Europe. With Russia smashed, Hitler told his generals, Britain's last hope would be shattered. Furthermore, the East offered the one thing Germany desperately lacked: autarky. The Ukraine offered limitless grain to feed the Reich. The Caucasus offered the oil of Baku to fuel the panzers. If Germany could seize these resources, the British blockade would become irrelevant. Germany would be immune to starvation and fuel shortages. They could fight forever. It was a gamble of breathtaking scale. Hitler was betting that the Wehrmacht could destroy the largest army in the world, the Red Army, before the British could rebuild their strength or the Americans could intervene. He dismissed the Soviet military as a rotten structure that would collapse with one kick. In December 1940, ignoring the lessons of Napoleon and the warnings of history, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 21. Operation Barbarossa was born. The Wehrmacht would not sail west, it would march east. Spring 1941. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles, the Wehrmacht amassed the largest invasion force in human history. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces were poised to strike. Ideally, military planning is based on worst-case scenarios. But for Operation Barbarossa, German planning was based on the best-case scenario. It was built on a foundation of arrogance and a catastrophic failure of intelligence. The German military intelligence agency, the Abwehr, had engaged in wishful thinking rather than hard analysis. They estimated the Soviet Union possessed about 200 active divisions. They believed the Red Army was incapable of rapid mobilization or complex maneuvers. They looked at the Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939, where Russian troops had been humiliated by a much smaller Finnish force, and concluded that the Soviet giant had feet of clay. This assessment fueled Hitler's racial and ideological blindness. He viewed the Slavic people as inferior and the Bolshevik state as fragile. He famously declared to his commanders, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This wasn't just rhetoric, it was operational doctrine. The German General Staff, intoxicated by their swift victories in France and Poland, believed they had cracked the code of modern war. They assumed blitzkrieg would work anywhere, regardless of geography. But they had forgotten to look at the map. The distance from the Polish border to Moscow was equal to the distance from Berlin to the Atlantic Ocean, but without paved roads. German logistics planners warned that the supply lines would snap once the army advanced 500 kilometers. The trucks would break down in the Russian mud. The railway gauges were different and would need to be converted. The High Command ignored them. They scheduled the defeat of the Soviet Union for 8 to 10 weeks. There were no plans for winter warfare. No winter clothing was stockpiled. No anti-freeze for the tanks. Why prepare for winter when the war would be over by September? The German plan relied on a Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle. They intended to encircle and destroy the Red Army near the border. They assumed that once the border armies were destroyed, the Soviet state would simply collapse. They did not know that behind the Urals, Stalin had built a shadow industrial empire. They did not know that for every division the Germans destroyed, the Soviets could raise another. They were marching into a black hole of intelligence. As the soldiers waited for the signal to attack in June 1941, they believed they were embarking on another summer campaign, a quick march to glory. They had no idea they were walking into a meat grinder that would consume the Third Reich. The 22nd of June 1941. At 3:15 inches the morning, the artillery roared. 3 million German soldiers surged across the border, shattering the pre-dawn silence and the peace between the two powers. For the first few weeks, it appeared that Hitler's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The Wehrmacht sliced through Soviet lines with terrifying precision. The Luftwaffe caught the Red Air Force on the ground, destroying thousands of planes in the first days. It was a massacre. German panzer groups, led by commanders like Guderian and Hoth, raced ahead, executing vast encircling movements that swallowed entire Soviet armies whole. At Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. At Smolensk, another 300,000. The numbers were staggering. By mid-July, the Germans had captured or destroyed nearly 1 million Soviet troops. Hitler was euphoric. He declared that the war was practically won, that the Red Army had been dealt a mortal blow from which it could never recover. Even foreign observers in London and Washington began to write the Soviet epitaph, predicting a collapse within weeks. But as the German columns pushed deeper into the endless Russian steppe, the reality of the campaign began to diverge from the maps in Berlin. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union began to absorb the German momentum. The roads, marked on German maps as highways, turned out to be dirt tracks that dissolved into dust clouds under the summer sun, choking engines and destroying air filters. German tanks, designed for the paved roads of Western Europe, began to break down at alarming rates. The logistical tail could not keep up with the armored spearhead. Fuel tankers lagged behind, forcing panzers to stop and wait. Worse still was the nature of the resistance. In France, defeated units had surrendered. In Russia, cut-off Soviet units fought on with a savage, suicidal desperation. At the Brest fortress, Soviet defenders held out for weeks deep behind German lines, fighting without water or hope, refusing to lay down their arms. This was a new kind of war, an ideological war of annihilation. And then came the realization that shook the German General Staff to its core. In August, General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, wrote a chilling entry in his diary. He admitted that their pre-war intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. "We reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions," he wrote. "Now we have already counted 360. The Germans were destroying Russian armies, but new ones were appearing from the depths of the Eurasian landmass, seemingly out of thin air. The rotten structure was not collapsing. It was absorbing the blow and fighting back. The lightning war was slowly, imperceptibly, turning into a grinding war of attrition, exactly the scenario Hitler had turned east to avoid." The 22nd of June, 1941. At 3:15 inches the morning, the artillery roared. 3 million German soldiers surged across the border, shattering the pre-dawn silence and the peace between the two powers. For the first few weeks, it appeared that Hitler's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The Wehrmacht sliced through Soviet lines with terrifying precision. The Luftwaffe caught the Red Air Force on the ground, destroying thousands of planes in the first days. It was a massacre. German panzer groups, led by commanders like Guderian and Hoth, raced ahead, executing vast encircling movements that swallowed entire Soviet armies whole. At Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. At Smolensk, another 300,000. The numbers were staggering. By mid-July, the Germans had captured or destroyed nearly 1 million Soviet troops. Hitler was euphoric. He declared that the war was practically won, that the Red Army had been dealt a mortal blow from which it could never recover. Even foreign observers in London and Washington began to write the Soviet epitaph, predicting a collapse within weeks. But as the German columns pushed deeper into the endless Russian steppe, the reality of the campaign began to diverge from the maps in Berlin. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union began to absorb the German momentum. The roads, marked on German maps as highways, turned out to be dirt tracks that dissolved into dust clouds under the summer sun, choking engines and destroying air filters. German tanks, designed for the paved roads of Western Europe, began to break down at alarming rates. The logistical tail could not keep up with the armored spearhead. Fuel tankers lagged behind, forcing panzers to stop and wait. Worse still was the nature of the resistance. In France, defeated units had surrendered. In Russia, cut-off Soviet units fought on with a savage, suicidal desperation. At the Brest fortress, Soviet defenders held out for weeks deep behind German lines, fighting without water or hope, refusing to lay down their arms. This was a new kind of war, an ideological war of annihilation. And then came the realization that shook the German General Staff to its core. In August, General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, wrote a chilling entry in his diary. He admitted that their pre-war intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. "We reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions," he wrote. "Now we have already counted 360. The Germans were destroying Russian armies, but new ones were appearing from the depths of the Eurasian landmass, seemingly out of thin air. The rotten structure was not collapsing, it was absorbing the blow and fighting back. The lightning war was slowly, imperceptibly, turning into a grinding war of attrition, exactly the scenario Hitler had turned east to avoid." August 1941. The road to Moscow lay open, but the tanks stopped. In the sweltering heat of the Russian summer, a bitter argument erupted within the German High Command that would decide the fate of the war. The German Army Group Center was just 200 miles from the Soviet capital. The Red Army in front of them was reeling, disorganized, and vulnerable. General Guderian and the General Staff pleaded with Hitler to strike immediately at the heart of the Soviet beast. They argued that capturing Moscow, the hub of the Soviet rail network and communications, would decapitate the communist regime before winter arrived. But Hitler had different priorities. He looked at the map not as a soldier, but as an economist. He saw that while the center was advancing, the flanks were lagging. To the north, Leningrad held out. To the south, immense Soviet forces remained intact in the Ukraine. Hitler famously called his generals Knights of the Holy Grail, who knew nothing of the economics of war. He didn't care about the symbolic value of Moscow. He cared about the grain of the Ukraine, the coal of the Donbass, and the oil of the Caucasus. He ordered Guderian's panzer group to turn south, away from Moscow, to encircle the Soviet forces in Kiev. From a tactical standpoint, Hitler was right. The resulting Battle of Kiev was the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. When the trap snapped shut in September, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in a single pocket. It was a victory so massive it defied comprehension, surpassing even the triumphs in France. Hitler felt vindicated. He had secured the agricultural heartland of the Soviet Union and destroyed an entire army group. But strategically, it was a catastrophe. The Battle of Kiev had cost the Wehrmacht its most precious resource, time. For 6 critical weeks, the drive on Moscow had stalled. August and September, the best months for campaigning in Russia, had been spent fighting in the south. When the panzers finally regrouped and turned back toward Moscow for Operation Typhoon in October, the world around them had changed. The clear blue skies of summer were gone. The first rains of autumn began to fall, turning the Russian dirt roads into a bottomless glue-like mud known as the Rasputitsa. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses died of exhaustion pulling supply wagons through the mire. The Blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and maneuver, was literally stuck in the mud, and as the German advance slowed to a crawl, the temperature began to drop. The window for victory had slammed shut, but the order was still to advance. They were marching into a white hell, unaware that the time they spent winning in Kiev was the time they needed to survive Moscow. November 1941. The mud finally hardened. But it did not harden because it dried. It hardened because it froze. The temperature plummeted with a violence that no German manual had predicted. In Berlin, the meteorologists noted record lows. On the front lines outside Moscow, the mercury dropped to 20 degrees below zero, then 30, then 40. The German Wehrmacht, the most modern army in the world, was suddenly plunged into a primitive struggle for survival against the elements. The soldiers were still wearing the same lightweight denim uniforms they had marched in during the summer heat. There were no winter coats, no felt boots, no white camouflage. Hitler and the High Command had been so confident of a quick victory that they had deemed winter equipment unnecessary. Now, frostbite was claiming more casualties than Soviet bullets. Eyelids froze shut, fingers turned black, and snapped off like dry twigs. The machinery of war ground to a halt. The oil in the sumps of the panzers turned into a thick, useless tar. To start an engine, crews had to light fires underneath the tanks, risking explosion just to get the pistons moving. Yet, despite the freezing hell, the German advance guard pushed on. By early December, a reconnaissance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the town of Khimki. Through their binoculars, They could see the golden spires of the Kremlin glinting in the winter sun just 18 miles away. They were so close they could see the flashes of anti-aircraft guns defending the city. This was the high water mark of the Third Reich. They stood at the gates of Moscow, but they were a spent force, exhausted, frozen, and overextended. They had reached the limit of their logistics and their endurance. And then, the trap sprung. While the Germans were freezing, Stalin had been playing a high-stakes poker game of his own. For months, he had kept his elite Siberian divisions in the east, guarding against a potential Japanese attack. But thanks to a masterstroke of intelligence from the spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, Stalin learned that Japan had decided to strike south against the United States, not north against Russia. Secure in this knowledge, Stalin stripped the eastern border. He moved thousands of fresh, well-equipped troops westward on the Trans-Siberian Railway. These were not the disorganized conscripts the Germans had fought in June. These were hardened soldiers, dressed in quilted winter gear, equipped with skis, and supported by T-34 tanks that could operate in the snow. On December 5, 1941, just as the German offensive ran out of steam, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. It hit the exhausted German lines like a sledgehammer. The Wehrmacht, which had never known defeat, was forced to retreat. The myth of German invincibility was shattered in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. Hitler's gamble had failed. The lightning war was dead. Now, Germany faced exactly what it had feared most, a long, grinding war of attrition on two fronts. January 1942. The German front was teetering on the edge of total collapse. Under the relentless hammering of the Soviet winter offensive, panic began to spread through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. For the first time in the war, German soldiers were throwing away their weapons and fleeing. The ghost of Napoleon haunted every German officer. They remembered 1812. They knew that a retreat in the Russian winter could easily turn into a rout, a disintegration that would destroy the army completely. Field marshals and generals, including the legendary Heinz Guderian, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to plead for reality. They begged for permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal to shorter, defensible lines near Smolensk. They argued that holding the current positions in the open fields of snow without heavy equipment was suicide. They told Hitler that the troops were at the breaking point, that discipline was unraveling, and that the only way to save the army for a future offensive was to retreat and regroup. Hitler's response was a directive of fanatical rigidity that would define the rest of the war. He absolutely forbade any retreat. He issued the famous halt order, commanding every unit to stand and fight exactly where they were. He ordered them to dig trenches in the frozen ground with hand grenades if necessary, to create hedgehogs of all-around defense, and to hold every yard of conquered territory or die trying. "Not one step back," he screamed at his generals. He believed that once a withdrawal started, it would become an avalanche that no one could stop. In a fit of rage and paranoia, Hitler did more than just issue orders. He decapitated the leadership of the German army. He blamed the generals for the failure at Moscow, accusing them of cowardice and lack of National Socialist will. He fired Field Marshal von Brokich, the commander-in-chief of the army. He relieved Guderian of his command. He stripped General Hopner of his rank and pension for ordering a tactical withdrawal to save his men. In a move that would have fatal consequences, Hitler declared himself the new commander-in-chief of the army. The corporal was now directly in charge of daily military operations. Historians still debate the halt order. Tactically, it may have actually saved the German army from the total disintegration that befell Napoleon. By forcing the troops to stand, Hitler stabilized the front, albeit at a horrific cost in human life. But strategically, it marked the end of the professional German military. From this moment on, the war was guided not by military logic, but by Hitler's intuition. The Wehrmacht that emerged from the snows of 1942 was a broken shadow of its former self. It had survived the winter, but it had lost its best officers, its best soldiers, and its operational independence. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. And as spring approached, Hitler's eyes turned away from Moscow, toward a city on the Volga that would become the graveyard of the German soul, Stalingrad. Sommer etusin 1944. The snow had melted, and with it, The German memory of the winter disaster seemed to evaporate. Hitler, restored to a mood of dangerous optimism, convinced himself that the Red Army had spent its last reserves defending Moscow. He believed the Soviet bear was bleeding to death. For the summer campaign, codenamed Case Blue, he abandoned the center. Moscow was no longer the target. The new prize was the black gold of the Caucasus, oil. Germany was running out of fuel. Without the oil fields of Baku and Grozny, the Wehrmacht would grind to a halt by 1943. The strategic logic was sound-starved the Soviet engine of fuel, but the operational execution was flawed by arrogance. Hitler stripped the other fronts to concentrate all available armor in the south. He created a massive hammer, Army Group South, designed to smash through to the Volga and the mountains. But then, in July 1942, Hitler made a decision that many historians consider his single greatest operational error of the war. Intoxicated by the initial rapid advance, he decided he could have it all. He split his forces. He ordered Army Group A to drive south into the Caucasus to seize the oil, and Army Group B to drive east to the Volga to cut the supply lines. And there, on the banks of the Volga, stood a city named after his nemesis, Stalingrad. Taking the city was not originally a primary strategic necessity. Cutting the river traffic was. But the name Stalingrad acted like a magnet for Hitler's ego. He became obsessed. He diverted the Sixth Army, the largest and best-equipped formation in the German military under General Friedrich Paulus, to take the city at all costs. As the Germans approached, the nature of the war changed again. In the open steppe, the panzers were kings. But as they entered the industrial wasteland of Stalingrad, they lost their advantage. The Blitzkrieg was swallowed by the rubble. The battle devolved into Rattenkrieg rat war. Soldiers fought room to room, sewer to sewer. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into a jagged moonscape, but this only created better defensive positions for the Soviet snipers and machine gunners. The Sixth Army was slowly being sucked into a meat grinder, consuming division after division. Meanwhile, on the maps in Berlin, the flanks of the German salient looked terrifyingly long and thin. They were guarded not by elite German units, but by under-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. The German generals warned Hitler that the flanks were vulnerable, that the Sixth Army was sticking its head into a noose. But Hitler, fixated on the map of the city, refused to listen. He saw only the capture of Stalingrad. He did not see the million Soviet soldiers gathering in the darkness on the horizon, preparing to snap the trap shut. The 19th of November, 1942. On the freezing steppes north and south of Stalingrad, the silence was shattered by the roar of 3,500 Soviet guns. Operation Uranus had begun. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet strategic mastermind, had identified the fatal weakness in the German deployment, the flanks. While the elite German Sixth Army was grinding itself to dust inside the city ruins, its rear was guarded by under-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. The Soviet hammer fell not on the German steel, but on the Allied glass. The Romanian armies, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, collapsed almost instantly under the weight of the Soviet armor. In just 4 days, the Soviet pincers raced across the snow-covered plains and met at the town of Kalash, deep behind German lines. The trap had snapped shut with terrifying speed. Inside the Kessel, or cauldron, nearly 300,000 men of the Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were completely cut off. General Paulus radioed Hitler, requesting immediate permission to break out before the Soviet ring solidified. He wanted to abandon the ruined city and save his army to fight another day. This was the moment of truth. A rational commander would have cut his losses. But Hitler was no longer operating in the realm of military rationality. He was operating on prestige and delusion. He remembered the previous winter, where his stand-fast order had seemingly worked. He declared Stalingrad to be a Festung, a fortress. He forbade any breakout. The Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last round, he ordered. To make matters worse, Hermann Göring committed one of the greatest crimes of the war. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air. He promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies a day, the absolute minimum needed for survival. It was a lie born of vanity. The Luftwaffe simply did not have the transport planes or the infrastructure. On their best days, they barely managed 100 tons. The soldiers inside the pocket began to starve. They ate their horses, then they boiled their leather belts for soup. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a desperate relief operation, Winter Storm. His panzers fought their way to within 30 miles of the trapped army. Manstein urged Paulus to defy Hitler and break out to meet him. But Paulus, a rigid staff officer paralyzed by his oath of loyalty to the Führer, refused to move without a direct order. The order never came. Manstein's forces were eventually pushed back by fresh Soviet reserves, and the door to salvation slammed shut forever. The Sixth Army was left to rot in the snow, sacrificed on the altar of Hitler's ego. The most powerful field army Germany had ever assembled was doomed. January 1943. The end was apocalyptic. The last airfield at Potomnik had been overrun by Soviet tanks, ending the erratic supply flights. The German Sixth Army, once the master of the European battlefield, had been reduced to a shivering mass of starving men hiding in the cellars of a ruined city. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers fought each other for the last scraps of bread. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and the Volga River froze solid, a mocking bridge to safety that no German could reach. In Berlin, Hitler played his final, cynical card. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, he promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall Field Marshal. In the history of the Prussian and German military, no field marshal had ever surrendered alive. The message was implicit but clear. Paulus was expected to commit suicide to preserve the honor of the Reich. Hitler wanted a martyr, a Wagnerian hero to inspire the nation. But Paulus, disillusioned and watching his men die for a madman's vanity, refused to play the role. The next day, January 31st, 1943, he emerged from his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store and surrendered to a Soviet lieutenant. The images of the surrender shocked the world. The field marshal, unshaven and gaunt, was not a conqueror, but a broken man. The aftermath was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Over 91,000 German soldiers, the survivors of the original 300,000, were marched into Soviet captivity. They walked through the snow to camps in Siberia and Central Asia. Of those 91,000 men, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died of typhus, starvation, and overwork in the gulags. The Sixth Army had effectively ceased to exist. Stalingrad was not just a lost battle. It was the psychological and strategic turning point of World War II. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was buried in the rubble of the city. For the first time, the German people realized that the war could be lost. The initiative had passed permanently to the Red Army. From this moment on, the Wehrmacht would never launch another successful strategic offensive. It would be a long, bloody retreat, mile by mile, all the way back to the Brandenburg Gate. The fatal error of 1940 had come full circle. Hitler had turned east to secure the resources needed to defeat Britain and deter America. Instead, by attacking the Soviet Union, he had drained Germany of the very resources, men, oil, and time that were essential for its survival. He had sought Lebensraum, or living space, but instead, he had found only a graveyard for his army. The decision to invade Russia before defeating Britain created the nightmare of a two-front war against the world's greatest industrial powers. In the end, the road to Berlin didn't start in Normandy. It started the moment the first German tank crossed the Soviet border, marching blindly into a war it could not win. The Third Reich had not been defeated by the winter, or by bad luck. It had been defeated by the arrogance of believing it could conquer the world with a strategy built on sand.